Hello, my online learners. As we look at excretion and water movement through the body, it's important we continue on and look at the fluid, the electrolytes, and the acid-base balance of the body. So we're going to take just a short time in chapter 20. And what we're going to look at is the major components, how the fluid moves between, how we get water in and out of the body, how the body maintains electrolyte balance. And we're going to look at sodium, potassium, and calcium, which we've talked about already in the course. So it's not quite as daunting as it seems because we've mentioned these before. Then we're going to look at buffers and how it affects the acid-base balance of the body. And then we're going to look at how the kidneys affect the acid-base balance of the body. Then look at how the kidneys and the lungs interact. If you remember back, we talked about lungs. If you increase the lung capacity, the breathing capacity, you'll blow off carbon dioxide, which will remove the acidity of the blood. So we're going to look at how the kidneys have a long-term effect as opposed to the lungs have a short-term effect. And then we're going to briefly go into a condition called alkalosis and acidosis. It's very technical and we don't need to get into all that technical detail. Okay, so let's start in chapter 20. Let's move this over a bit. When we look at fluid compartments, I need to just increase this. When we look at the fluid compartments, realize that water is very important in the body. It's about, it changes based on your size, your fat composition, and your age. Water is about 60% in males, 50% in females, and I think it's about 75% in children. Anyway, water will move from one compartment to the other. First off, we have two categories. We have intracellular. Intra means inside. So the majority of the water or the fluid in the body is found inside the cells, and that's important to establish what's called tonicity, or the plumpness of the cells. And then the other 35 is extracellular. Now, extracellular is broken down again into interstitial. So this is between tissues. Then you have plasma, which is inside the blood vessels. Lymph, which is inside the lymph vessels. And then extracellular fluid, and this is kind of like the extra stuff. So this is the fluid inside the vitreous of your eyes, the fluid inside your joints, a little in the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's kind of the extra. Now what I want you to realize is fluid goes from one to the other based on tonicity or osmolarity. We talked about osmosis way back in the beginning of the course. And osmosis will move, or osmosis is the process of the water moving to balance out the concentrations of salt. Now realize that you can't push water, well, you can with pressure, but most water movement moves because of the salt concentration. So if you move salt, water will follow. So if you have a situation where you want to move salt or move water out of a cell, you pump salt. A great example of this is aldosterone. Aldosterone will move pump the salt out of the loop of Henle. Sorry. I had to draw it in my mind. The loop of Henle and the distal convoluted tubule, salt will move, and then as a result of water will then flow to kind of equalize the salt concentration. And this is called osmolarity, sometimes called osmolality. It's similar. It basically has to do with the concentration of the non-salt particles. So water moves out of the cells when a concentration of electrolytes is inside the tissue fluid. So remember, the fluid inside the tissue is called interstitial fluid. So the interstitial fluid, if that becomes very salty, water will move into it. Now, water will move into the cells when the concentration of electrolytes will fall. So what you're doing is you're actually controlling salt, and then that, as a result, controls the water. So when we look at where water comes from in the body, water it's pretty obvious. Well, I think so. You gain most of your water by drinking it, and you lose most of your water by peeing it out. Now, there is a small amount of water in food and a small amount created by metabolism. If you remember way back to cellular respiration, glucose plus water produces glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water. And that water is a waste product of you breaking down your glucose, but only about 200 milliliters a day. So it's not a lot, and it goes back in the body and gets reused. So you should be taking 2.5 liters of water in every day. You should be. And then you pee out about 2.5 milliliters of water every day. Well, you pee it, you breathe it out, and you may realize if you go, especially on a mirror or on a mask, you get, you respire water. You also have water lost on your skin because of sweating and in your feces. Now realize your activity and the temperature outside will affect your water loss through skin. Okay, good. Water loss varies with activity and temperature, but to maintain balance, the body has mechanisms to adjust in and out. And that's very important that you keep it homeostasis of water. Now, when your total body water declines, it produces a physical change which stimulates the thirst center in the hypothalamus. So if your body water declines, that causes your blood to become more concentrated, or an increase in osmolality. So it's less water, more particles. This will then draw fluid out of your hypothalamus, so your hypothalamus will be triggered, and that's where your thirst center is, in your hypothalamus. That will cause salivation to decrease, so you're going to save on water, and it will trigger the thirst center, which tells you to consume water. Okay, let's look at the detail. It's in the textbook, page 408. You have various factors, such as excess sweating will cause a decline in water. Quite often that will cause your blood pressure to drop because you have less fluid, or you will have an increase in sodium. Now realize your sodium may just not necessarily increase by pumping a sodium, but by decreasing the water, it's increasing the sodium because you're taking away more water. So this causes your osmolarity to increase. That osmolarity will trigger the hypothalamus in the brain. And that hypothalamus in the brain will just trigger your thirst center, and it will cause you to get thirsty, and you drink. And as you drink, it will then be absorbed in your gut and eventually get to your blood again, and your water volume will rise. Now, if you have a longer term reaction, the mechanism of the thirst center stimulates the hypothalamus, as we talked about it, and then the hypothalamus will stimulate the posterior pituitary to secrete antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone will react on the, stimulate, not react. Stimulate the collective ducts and also the distal convoluted tubule to absorb more water. Remember that antidiuretic reacts with aquaporins, so it causes an increase in aquaporins. Aquaporins will then absorb more water from the urine, or from the nephron, the filtrate of the nephron. So the water goes from the filtrate into the blood, and you have less urine and you have more water in your blood. So that's a way of regulating. Okay. Now, quite often you can have a deficiency in your water, and that is called basically volume deficiency. And that's when you have a greater output over time. And that can be because of a volume depletion, or it means you're basically losing water too quickly. And the most common result there is diarrhea. Diarrhea means that your water is going through your digestive system too quickly. The large intestine is where the majority of the water is absorbed in your digestive system. And if the poop goes through too quickly, notice how diarrhea is really watery. That's because the water hasn't been reabsorbed into the body. So a very common cause of volume depletion is diarrhea. Or you could be dehydrated because you're not drinking enough water. This could be because of your concentration of sodium. It can also be because your water is shifting from one area to another, okay? Too much water deficiency can lead to shock because of a loss of blood volume, usually because you're bleeding out. And then loss of blood volume, things aren't working right, okay? When you have dehydration, you can actually pick up the skin, and if it doesn't spring back, you're dehydrated. The opposite, yes, so that's called tenting, okay? If your skin remains peaked, then it is dehydration, okay? When we're talking about fluid loss, there is a term called turgor right here on the purple part under the body at work. The fluid within the tissues, which is interstitial fluid, is a readily source of fluid to help maintain blood volume during early stages of blood loss. So it's not in the blood, but interstitial means it can flow between the tissues. So if you are losing fluid loss, that will take the blood, it'll take the fluid out of the tissues, which eventually take the fluid out of the cells. So there's a loss of turgor pressure in the skin. Okay, good. This is just a basic a diagram to show how water will shift. So if you're sweating off water and a little bit of salt, that will then, because of osmosis, pull water from the sweat glands. From the bloodstream will go to the sweat gland, and then that'll pull between the tissues, the interstitial fluid, and that'll eventually pull the fluid out of the cells. And if you don't have fluid in your cells, you will then have improper cells. So notice how if you pull water from one area, it tries to balance. So that intracellular fluid, which is inside the cells, is balanced with interstitial and extracellular. It all moves around basically by the pulling of the salt. Okay. Now you can also have water accumulation, and water accumulation means there is too much water, and this is a condition called edema or swelling. And with edema, I can't do it on me because I'm not very edemic, but it's called the pit test. If you push and you leave a little pit, then you are swollen with edema. This can happen, usually happens with kidney failure, which means both your sodium, your potassium aren't working. You can also have water intoxication if you're consuming too much water, so you're replacing the water and not the sodium. If the sodium in your extracellular fluid drops, water will move into your extracellular fluid, causing it to swell in your extracellular fluid. Okay. Now, this is all important because as you're balancing your water, you're balancing your electrolytes. We're going to look at electrolyte balance, just a brief overview. It may sound like a lot of information, but we've already talked about these main electrolytes. So the main cations are sodium, potassium, calcium, and hydrogen ion. Remember that hydrogen ion has to do with pH. The main anions are chloride, bicarbonate, and inorganic phosphate. And if you remember, you need to have the positives match the negatives to keep things balanced. So when we look at sodium, sodium is the main electrolyte in the extracellular fluid. So the body's always pumping it out, and it'll determine the volume of total body water. And it also influences how the water is distributed. And if you remember, sodium is very important in muscles and in terms of nerves, so nerves and muscles. So if you're not having enough sodium, you have nerve and muscle problems. And a really good example of this is if you're sweating too much, or if you're out in the sun, you get cramps or you get shaky because you don't have enough sodium. Sodium is very important, muscles and nerves. And we've talked about this already. So it's kind of a summary. So don't get overwhelmed by all these lists because it's a summary of what we talked about. When we talk about sodium regulation, we talked about sodium and aldosterone. So if the sodium levels are low, it will affect aldosterone through the aldosterone is, okay, if you remember aldosterone, so sodium levels is low. It'll affect blood pressure, juxtaglomerular apparatus, renin, angiotensinogen, aldosterone. Aldosterone pumps sodium, water follows, okay? And it will rise and go back to normal. Antidiuretic hormone, it will suppress it, and then the kidneys will secrete water, and they will not, they will get rid of water, so that way it will all balance out. So that sodium will then rise through aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. If your sodium is too high in your blood, then antidiuretic hormone will reabsorb the water to help dilute it. And antidiuretic hormone will also stimulate the thirst center, so you drink more water, it's absorbed through the large intestine, and your sodium levels are diluted, and sodium is back to normal. Okay, now there talks about the conditions of hyper and hypo. I don't want you to be too concerned with the values. Just realize that sodium levels are very important. If there is too much of it, it will result in a fluid deficit, and usually triggered by, it's corrected by thirst. And if it's too low, as in hypo, your body will remove excess water, usually by the kidneys. Okay, so it's balanced. Now that is normal. Realize also that when changing your sodium levels, you'll often affect your volume levels. Potassium is the main intracellular fluid. Okay, think of sodium, potassium, ATPase pump. Sodium goes out into the extracellular fluid, potassium goes into the intracellular fluid. So they work hand in hand, and they're important for nerve and muscle function. Too much. Now this is really weird. Kalemia. Kalemia is potassium. Remember that the symbol for potassium is K, so it's Latin. Hyper means you have too much. And again, it'll affect your nerves and your muscle cells. And if you have too little, it affects your nerves and muscle cells because they become less excitable. And usually it's a result of vomiting and diarrhea. Quite often, anything to do with water balancing is vomiting and diarrhea. Okay. Calcium. We've talked about calcium before in terms of calcium strengthens your bones. Calcium is used in muscle contraction. Calcium is used in triggering that part of the axon to release neurotransmitters, so it'll affect nerve transmission. Calcium is used as a cofactor in the clotting cascade. So if there's a change in calcium, it will affect all these things. Remember how we talked about calcium levels are regulated by the parathyroid hormone and also calcitonin from the thyroid gland. Again, I want you to be aware that changes in calcium will affect depolarization, which is going to affect your muscles and your heart, which is another one. And it affects the excitation of your nerves and your muscles. Main thing here is nerves, muscles, and your heart. Calcium is very important in your heart. And you don't want your heart not contracting properly. Okay? Good. Here's a good question. What is the main one in your extracellular fluid? Extra. So remember that potassium is your intracellular fluid. Potassium works opposite of sodium, so that is the extracellular fluid. Now realize that it asks for chloride or cation. Chloride is an anion, so that's why that one's wrong. And calcium isn't, it's important, but it's not the main one. Good. Yay. Now, when we talk about acid-base balance, it is very important in the blood that the blood stay between 7.35 and 7.45. Any slight variation of becoming acid, which is acidosis, or basic, which is alkalosis, can be fatal. And this is done by a bicarb, a buffer. So first off, let me describe what a buffer is. A buffer is a chemical system of usually a weak base and a weak acid that will bind to hydrogen or release hydrogen depending on how it's needed. And there are 3 buffer systems in the body. The first one is the bicarb one, the second one is phosphate, and the third one is a protein. And all of them will take and absorb hydrogen. Okay, a little chemistry. Let's go back to the textbook. If you have Chem 30, you should be able to understand, but if this is confusing, just realize hydrogen goes on, hydrogen comes off, and it's all based on the carbon dioxide. So let's go at the top and look at the green carbon dioxide. When the carbon dioxide builds up on the tissues, the carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce carbonic acid, which is very unstable and will quickly break down to hydrogen ions and this carbonic or bicarbonate ion. The bicarbonate ion is a way of getting rid of this acidity. However, you have this H+, and this H+ will add to the pH. Okay, it will increase the pH. So what you do is if you breathe out the carbon dioxide, it will pull it aside. Now notice too how you have this negativity. So just by breathing, you can shift this reaction from one way to another. Now, if you put bicarbonate into the system, which the kidney will reabsorb bicarbonate, this sentence here, binding with bicarbonate removes the hydrogen ions from the solution and raises the pH. So you do not want the pH low because it's acidic. Okay, so here's a way how this is the bicarbonate ion buffer system. So if you have too much too much hydrogen, the carbonate can take it, react it, and produce carbon dioxide. And you just breathe out and you've got it carbon dioxide removed from the body. Okay, and this is done and all stimulated by your respiratory rate. Remember how we talked about your amount of pH is regulated by your medulla oblongata way back when we talked about respiration. Now, respiration and the urinary system work hand in hand. To control pH quickly, you just increase your breathing. If you increase your breathing rate, you will increase the amount of carbon dioxide. And it removes the amount of carbon dioxide from your blood, which will then pull the reaction and it will become less acidic or higher pH. Okay. So that is the quick breathing way. In the kidneys will absorb this bicarbonate. So here, I don't have my down here you see this purple bubble. The purple bubble will absorb the carbonate because it is taken into the body. So box number 3. Carbonic acid immediately dissociates to yield hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ion. The hydrogen ions diffuse out of the cell and they are displaced by sodium. The displaced sodium diffuses into the tubular cell and is combined with bicarbonate to form sodium bicarbonate. So this is a good way. The sodium bicarbonate is then released into the blood and the bicarbonate, so the hydrogen gets out of the body and goes into the urine, and then the bicarbonate goes into the blood to neutralize it. In the end, the hydrogen ions are excreted into the urine while the sodium bicarbonate goes into the blood. Both actions help raise pH. Okay, so too acidic, you move out hydrogen ions, you move in bicarbonate ions, and it balances. So that's the carbon dioxide, bicarbonate ion balance. Okay, and the others work similar. With phosphate, you have PO4, and the others work similar in the fact that you're just moving bicarbonate. And the whole idea with the balance is just to add or subtract what you need in order to balance the pH. Okay, good. Now, there is a situation where if your lungs aren't working correctly, you can't blow off enough carbon dioxide, your blood will become acidic, and your kidneys will compensate. So that's sort of like the compensation. If your kidneys aren't working properly to regulate that hydrogen, your lungs will compensate and blow off more carbon dioxide. And that is the easiest way to talk about compensation. The respiratory system will compensate for the respiratory system compensates for the renal system. If one doesn't work to get rid of the compensation, the other compensates. So that's kind of the way to look at it. Okay, let's summarize one more time. In general, the body uses the respiratory system to compensate for metabolic pH imbalances and the kidneys to compensate for respiratory pH balances. That makes sense. If your respiratory system is failing and you can't get rid of carbon dioxide through breathing or increasing your breathing, your kidneys balance. If your kidneys, which is metabolically, aren't getting rid of the pH or the bicarbonate or the other acidic causing thing, your respiratory rate balances. And that is the easiest way to summarize. So example here is if your blood is building up an acidosis situation because your kidneys your respiratory rate isn't getting rid of it, your kidney will, if it's acidic, if your blood is acidic, your kidney absorbs more bicarbonate to neutralize the hydrogen and excrete more hydrogen. Okay? It sounds a little confusing, and it is kind of, but realize that one compensates for the other. And that is the end of the detail of chapter 20.